This is Katinka.
And this is Simone. And you are listening to the Novotech podcast.
Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation with Tyler Evans, Quartz Fraud Analytics Manager at ANZ Bank. In part 1 of the podcast, we talked about Tyler's journey from academia to the world of fraud analytics and had an introduction to different types of fraud. In this episode, we delve deeper into the topic of combating fraud. We'll discuss keeping up with changes and the role of a manager.
So you spoke about a little bit about to combat fraud, but what are the main techniques to combat fraud? What do you think the recent technology allows us to do in this space that a few years back could not have been possible? And I'm curious about this. How does Australia compare to other countries such US and UK, for example?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. So we actually do benchmark and communicate with other countries and other continents. I think at a fundamental level, what fraud detection looks like is finding outliers. So you have the vast majority of customers as genuine. People that want to do the right thing or spending money in a way that is perfectly normal. And then every once in a while, you're talking tenths of a percent, hundredths of a percent, you get something bad happen. And so if you want to go into the world of cliches, it's in some ways looking for a needle in a haystack. There are certain types of fraud that are actually much more challenging to find than a needle in a haystack. I had a manager many years ago now who described it less as finding a needle in a haystack as finding a specific needle in a stack of needles. So it's not just that, it's something different in a field of a huge number of things that look similar. In some ways, it's something that looks the same within a field of a huge number of similar transactions. But at the root of it, what it is profiling and outlier analysis. So in an ideal world, what you'd have is sort of a profile of what all of your customers do. What does a normal spend pattern look like to them? And then if you find something that sticks out, it's a matter of then flagging that and saying, how weird is it that sticks out? So, there are times of year where people spend differently. This takes us a bit back into our previous conversation. Yes, fraud takes up during Black Friday, as we've recently gone past the Black Friday sales. That's relevant in my mind. But also, customers tend to spend a bit differently when there's big sales on. So it's not just a matter of, this person only spends $100 a week and all of a sudden they spent $1,000, because they may very well do that at certain times of the year. It's how is that then different from what a fraudster would do? As I said, there's sort of that profiling and understanding. And then there's some simpler stuff as well. So I think one of the rules that we use as an industry, especially in the card fraud space, is something that's affectionately referred to as magic carpet rule. And what that means is that there's a card present transaction. So you've got your card in your hand, you've gone to the grocery store, you've tapped it at the terminal. We can tell that you had the card there. And then let's say you've done that 5 minutes up the road from your house in Melbourne. Somebody in London then spends on your card with the card present. So there's another tap or there's a swipe. And that's happened in a faster amount of time than it would take you to hop on a plane and fly to that country. That's not possible. So that would be, you've got to get on a magic carpet. You've got to fly there in order to actually make that transaction be possible. So that's a very, simplistic view of what it means to do something that's weird. That gets a lot more complicated based on regular spend patterns and whether that person's online or whether they always spend in person or whether they take cash out and then spend. But from a simplistic view, if something isn't possible, it's probably fraud. In terms of comparing to other industries, so other countries, it's challenging. So we actually see different things across the world. And a large part of that is based on the regulators in each of the different countries. So what regulates spend within Australia is very different from what regulates spend and fraud within the US, the UK, Canada, etc. In a lot of ways, we're probably most similar to Canada. though oftentimes we lag behind in trends by a couple of years. So it can be really interesting to have a chat with the Canadian banks and the Canadian financial institutions and ask them what they're seeing, because it's something that we may see down the road. That being said, all in all, it's different. The US is still struggling to get people to use chip tap. So, you may pop into a grocery store or you may, fill up your tank of petrol, and you go to the terminal and take out your card and tap it against the terminal, and that's the pay. In the US, they still rely heavily on swiping. And so that's an industry difference. So chips are very, very, very difficult to counterfeit. A mag stripe, the thing that you swipe through the reader, is quite easy to counterfeit. The problem is that the infrastructure in the US doesn't support quick responses to the chip. So you swipe your card in the US and you have a response almost immediately. In the US, you tap your card or you put it into the card reader and you don't get a response for 15 seconds. And that's something that customers find very, very challenging. It's a lot easier in a small country like Australia, so we have a good infrastructure around that. But look, there are legitimate reasons for why it's a challenge in the US, but it also means it's a lot easier for fraudsters to counterfeit cards.
And do you expect that fraud will become even more relevant and perhaps harder to combat in the era of open banking, when we will have a lot more personal information floating around? And what else do you think we might see in the coming years?
I hope not. I don't know if that's a fair answer, but so the nice thing about open banking is that people are in charge of their own details. So one possibility is an increase in scams. So where customers are willingly giving over their details. But the idea behind open banking is that if you're switching from one financial institution to another, you can request that the previous institution share it with the next institution. So ideally, the way that works is that even if a fraudster were to ask for that, they would not see the details. It would go from one financial institution to the next, one bank to the next. The fraudster would never see that. And then in order to set up an account with that new one, you'd still have to pass customer verification. You have to present your identity. You'd have to show up to branch. You'd have to do something to prove that you are you. So at this stage, I think that open banking is actually not too much of a risk. I say that with a grain of salt because we'll have to see what happens. but I'm quite optimistic about it. Actually, I think it is quite good. One of the recent technology changes that has come into place is the new payments platform. So NPP or OSCO. So if you've transferred money to a friend or another person recently, usually not institutions, but you may see that the transfer says powered by OSCO. And what that is it's an instant or within 15-second transfer of funds from one person to another. And that's quite different from how banking used to be in Australia. And that's slowed down the amount of time that we have to catch fraud through digital channels. So that has posed an increased threat. Going back to the previous question, the UK did this about 5 years ago, and it was an absolute disaster. We implemented this about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I want to say. And it went pretty well. There's definitely more fraud. But it wasn't the same sort of overwhelming situation as what they saw in the UK. So yes, there are more challenges, but things change. Other avenues get closed off. So as the fraudsters develop new technologies, so do we. So at the end of the day, fraud really harkens back to a day in the Wild West when a masked bandit walks into a bank and holds out a revolver and says, stick them up, empty your vault into my bag. And that's the same thing that we're dealing with today, except it's the digital channels instead of in person. So, the amount of money that you can steal as a criminal is higher. But thank goodness you're not putting people's lives at risk, or at least not in physical risk. It can absolutely have an impact on the quality of life of the people that are impacted. But it's less of the physical threat, and it's looking at new channels. And as that's developed, so have we. So, we may look at people's devices as they apply. We'll say, can we have your consent to monitor your iPhone when you're in our app? And if the person gives their consent, then we're able to tell that it's the same iPhone, Android, whatever. It's the same device that they've logged in with for the last 30 transactions. And then a new device comes through and we can say, this doesn't look like the right person. So our ability to detect it improves and the ability for fraudsters to take advantage of customers improves. And that's what I was talking about earlier with that sort of chess match of they make a move, we make a move, back and forth. And we may invest in technologies that make it harder for fraudsters, and they'll invest in technologies that make it harder for us. So I would say that what the future holds, and this is, I don't know, if you'd asked me this a year ago, I wouldn't have predicted COVID. So who's to trust what I say? But from a fraud point of view, it really seems like we're getting the hang of the digital technologies. We're able to keep customers safe from a digital perspective, which means that fraudsters and criminals are targeting customers instead of the platforms. And that's where you start to get into scams. And that's where you start to get into taking advantage of people in a difficult situation. People who may be older and not understand the internet, or people who might be worried about getting the next paycheck, or people who haven't had any contact with the outside world and all of a sudden somebody wants to talk to them. And that, we sort of classify that as a romance scam. That doesn't have to be romance. It's just humans connecting with humans. And the fraudsters and the criminals are willing to put in that time in order to steal your money, which is tragic in a way. So I think we're moving to a space where criminals want to take advantage of people rather than technology.
Yeah, I suppose they will be going to where the weakest link is, right?
Yeah, exactly.
I also wanted to make a point because you mentioned that if a customer gives you consent to monitor their device, so this might sound so invasive, but you are doing this to detect potential risk. And oftentimes we are just so afraid of technology and especially this aspect of it. But this really shows that, we can really embrace and cooperate. And if we embrace technology, this might actually be beneficial for us. So I really like this point that you were making here.
Yeah, and that's an interesting comment to make, and thank you. Yes, in a lot of ways, we are looking out for the customer. But one of the interesting aspects of that is that we will ask your consent. Fraudsters won't. So the information that you post on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, fraudsters are skimming through that. They're trying to find everything they can about you there. The bank will not do that. Financial institutions will not do that. Any legal group of people will not do that. So we will ask you to tick a box that says, yes, it's okay if you track what device I'm on, but we will ask you before we do it. Fraudsters will be looking up on your Facebook to see if you mentioned your mother's maiden name. They'll look for your date of birth to try and guess your PIN. They'll look for things that you're willingly sharing and not realizing are available to the public. So it's definitely a case of please be mindful of what you do share with the public and how available that is. And that, there are people out there that don't necessarily want to do the best thing by you, which is a scary thing to think. And most people will not be affected, but it is a possible outcome.
I still prefer the golden rule. Well, what I call golden rule. The less personal information you publicly share, the better.
Yeah. it depends on the people. I've met people that say, hey, I don't have anything to hide. It doesn't matter what I share. This is a completely different conversation to get into. I'm sure we could do a 5-part series on the fact that you can tell from my accent that I come from America, where we don't want to share information with the government at any cost. So it's a challenging position to be in. I would say, especially in Australia, there is a lot of work to try and watch out for people. It's very much a community where even if a business doesn't want to do right by somebody, the regulators will then step in very quickly and try and make them do the right thing. So it's hard to say. I hear you. I don't have a good response to that. Like, in theory, in my mind, it's like, yes, I'm sharing with anyone. Like that's what I grew up with. And then I come here and I'm just like, but we can help you so much if you just allow us to help you. And so it's a balance, and it depends. And it's, what are you comfortable with?
So you are a manager of the cards fraud analytics team. What were the key turning points that led you to become a leader in this space? Do you have any advice for people who want to occupy any managing position? What can they expect and how can they prepare?
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, it probably actually harkens back to a really fabulous leader, manager that I had. when I first started off. And I think you can say that about a lot of things. You hear people that have ended up in the field because of a good teacher they've had. And so having a good experience with somebody who can show you how it's done makes a big impact on what happens next in your life. So as I said, I started off in academia. I was sort of in the nitty gritty, doing research, doing analytics, building models, doing data collection, building pipelines. And then I moved into fraud, where I continued doing more or less the same thing, but in a different field. And I had a manager who, more than anything else, really cared about the people and how they did. And you see so many jokes, movies, films, whatever. Like you see things that come up sort of making fun of managers and how terrible they are and how it's, if they just went away, we'd be able to get our jobs done. And I had this experience with a manager who really made me feel like the work I was doing was important and that it contributed and that he wanted to see me grow regardless of whether or not that was in the team or a different team within the same bank or completely separate. And that really, it sounds so cliche, but it was very inspirational. And so as I started doing more work in the analytics space, I found that people would start to come to me and ask me questions. And I found it really rewarding when I was able to help them out, help them achieve their goals. And so as I sort of spent more time in the field and got to know more people, both within my bank and other banks, other financial institutions across the industry, I found that I really liked seeing other people succeed. And I would say, if you want to be a manager, it's about helping other people. If you want to make money, we've talked about this as well, there are other jobs you can do. There are job paths you can do within analytics that pay really well. You don't need to become a manager to make money. And you should not become a manager to make money. You should become a manager because you want to see other people do well. And at times that will be attributing success to one of your peers or one of your employees, even if you've done 50% of the work, even if you've done 60% of the work. What you're doing is you're highlighting what they've done. You're highlighting how they've succeeded to other people. You're making them feel good about themselves. You're helping them come up with new ideas in the future. The single most important thing to me about being a leader of people is making them want to come into work in the morning. So if somebody is showing up and they don't want to be there, they can put in their 8 hours, but it's not going to revolutionize anything. It's not going to be what changes the field. It's not going to be what changes their lives. It's not going to be what impacts a customer. You want somebody that comes in and says, I have this idea and I want to follow it. And you have to nurture that and light that flame and allow it to grow. That being said, there is 100%, there are times where everyone has to buckle down and do things they don't want to do. It's not about having fun all the time. It's about making the workplace a community, a place where you can grow, a place where you're supported. Even when you're doing the things you don't want to be doing, you know that, when you've eaten your vegetables, you get to dessert. So there's always something there at the end that you get to look forward to, something that you want to be working on. And so the biggest sort of turning point for me when I wanted to become a manager was understanding that I could help people see that. So I could understand the analytical background. I come from a background that you come from. I get the code. I can sit down with you. I can go through your code. When there's an emergency and we're all here until 10 p.m., I'm sitting next to you. I'm coding next to you. But at the same time, when you ask me, where do I go next in my career? I can say, these are the people we want to talk to. This is the sort of thing you want to work on. What's important to you? What do you like doing? Do you want to manage people? Do you want to keep going in analytics? And it's a conversation I've had with people. So I've had employees who have gone on to other institutions, and I've written them glowing reviews. On the other hand, I've had times where people have had challenging points in their career. It's not all daisies and sunshine. There are times where, you take somebody out for a coffee and say, hey, I noticed things have been tough. What's going on? And you separate that from the work. And you really just have to identify that everyone's a person. Like it's, again with the cliches, right? Like at the end of the day, like you're dealing with people. You're not dealing with a faceless void. You're dealing with other people. And so the fact that things come up and that you have to understand that and be flexible is super important. And wanting them to grow and come back and be excited that even when something bad happens, they still want to improve That's where, in my view, good management happens.
Yeah, definitely. That's what they call the serving leader, right?
Is it? I'm actually not familiar with that term.
Yeah, it's basically exactly what you said, but just summarizing in these two words, serving leader. Exactly the leader who will be there to support the growth of their team.
When a team is happy, they're delivering well. And if they're happy, then they want to be there. So let's do it. Let's make the team happy. Let's make them increase their productivity, but also develop.
A follow-up question is to manager as a manager, but I'm curious to see how you do balance between, your own development as a manager versus still coding, still knowing, the nitty-gritty detail of the technology. How do you see, someone in that position as a manager is still hands-on? Because it's very common, once you become a manager, at least the most of people I know, they completely stop being that detailed. How do you see this and how you make that happen?
That's an extremely difficult balance to maintain. So as you manage people and manage teams, you have to get more comfortable with delegating tasks. And that's actually a growth that I've had to go through. And that's having the trust in the people that work with you to be able to deliver without you doing it yourself. You get to a certain point and you can't deliver everything yourself. You have to trust and rely on the people around you. That being said, I sort of jokingly earlier mentioned about having your vegetables and having your dessert. For me, that dessert is keeping my fingers in the analytics. So I've got access to the same tables. I can run the same queries. I can do the same coding that my analysts can do for the most part, though on a day-to-day basis, I probably don't. And for me, when I get done with my work, when I get done with my meetings, I will oftentimes sit down and I'll spend a couple hours coding or working on something. And it's a matter of prioritization, which is difficult no matter what you're doing in your life. But spend a couple hours on yourself. And maybe it's not a couple hours every day, maybe it's a couple hours every week, but make sure that you're doing the things that make you happy as well. It's all well and good to preach that, you want your team to be happy and grow and develop, but if you're not doing it yourself, why are they going to follow you? So you need to take time for yourself, and you need to understand that there are things that are going to make you happy and keep you engaged and keep them going. And I would, for managers that are interested in analytics, I would absolutely encourage you to use that time to stay at least a finger dipped into the analytics. Because what happens is you get to points where it is all hands on deck. Everyone has to jump in. And if you can't help, you feel terrible. Like you see the people you care about working long hours and you can't do anything to help. That sucks. So if you have kept a toe in the water, if you've kept abreast of what's happening, you can jump in and you can be there next to the people working on it. So priorities. Take some time to do what you like. Make sure that you're staying happy. And if you are involved in what your team is working on, and your analysts and your data scientists, they will really respect that. They can come to you and they can say, hey, I've written this code. Can you debug it? And there's nothing worse than debugging someone else's code. But if you can do it, they will be so impressed. Like if you can sit down and actually go through it with them and talk them through what's wrong and ways to improve it, that will not only score you points, but look, it really earns you their respect and comes to a better outcome overall.
So staying on top of the latest fraud and scam trends is quite important in your field, and probably you also need the latest technology to do it. So how do you keep up with the changes within tech and in your particular field? And also, what are you curious about right now? What is the next thing you want to learn? And are there any tools or technology that makes your life easier?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what I'm curious right now is how we get people onto Mars and start exploring the solar system. But that's separate from fraud, so we'll talk about something else. Keeping up with tech and the industry is a huge part of probably any job, I imagine. Once you get to a certain level, it's really what's going on across the industry. And one of the things that I love about fraud, financial crime too, to some extent, is the collaboration across the industry. So oftentimes people think of banks and financial institutions as very insular. They want to improve their profit. They want to reduce their loss. And that's true for a big part of them. Within fraud, it's a community. I can literally pick up the phone and call somebody across the street from me. So I'm at ANZ. We've got Latitude between us. And then we've got NAB literally within a block. And I can pick up the phone and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What are you seeing? And they'll talk to me about it. And that's not something you see across many industries. So the fact that there is communication across the board, you can have those very frank conversations is, I think, probably what will keep me in fraud or fin crime as long as I'm in a financial institution. So a big part of that is understanding what are the threats. So you may see something that hits one bank before it hits another. And if we're talking to each other, we can prevent it. And overall, the goal that we have is to reduce fraud and crime within Australia. It doesn't benefit us to get rid of fraud at ANZ, but have it pop up at NAB, for example. That's not what we're after. It actually doesn't help us. Customers are still being impacted. A lot of customers have bank accounts across more than one bank. Like, it's not just us, it's all the customers. And so to be able to call them up and just say, hey, have you seen this? And then to get that feedback is awesome. So we have regular industry catch-ups, and those include not only the other financial institutions, but some of the bigger schemes as well. So we talk to the police, and they tell us what they're seeing. We talk to Visa, we talk to MasterCard, we talk to FPOS, and they tell us what they're seeing, and we share with them. And so as an industry, we want to make it harder to commit crimes. We don't want you to move the fraud out of one bank to another. We want to make Australia inhospitable to crime. And I love that. And it's such a satisfying feeling to know that what you're doing is helping people across the board. And as interesting as the analytics might be in customer experience or risk modeling, the fact that you can have that impact on people directly and know that you're helping is really what brings me back to fraud. So in terms of technology, it's ever growing, it's ever changing. There's always new vendors that want to send you new technology, and so it's always a balance between what can you afford and what do you want to implement. So what's the reward? What can you afford? That sort of thing. But there's been some really cool developments recently. So things around facial biometrics. So you may get a request to take a photo of yourself, and it may have hold up your driver's license and it tries to actually match that to government records or the picture on the license to who you are. And so there's some really cool things, more basically, even just your IP address or your device. And, you signed up and you've put in your email address. How long has that email address existed? So there's some basics around technology that are coming in that are exciting. But as I said, as we find out about these, so do the criminals, so do the fraudsters, and they react. So in my particular field, what are the tech changes that are relevant to me? Well, I'd like to see more modeling, I think. So for a long time, we've really relied on the expertise and experiences of people that have been in fraud. They've said, I've seen this sort of behavior before, I can pick it up. And that's absolutely true. I don't think we will ever replace the know-how and experience of people within this field. It's too fast-paced, it's too complicated. We're not anywhere near it with machine learning. That being said, the ability to pick out patterns and details that make analysts so great also provide a bias. So you need some way to remove that bias and say, well, how do I detect things I've never seen before? And that's where modeling is able to step in and actually work hand in hand with fraud analysts. And again, you have to be mindful of the ability to explain, so the explainability of a model. But even something like a simple decision tree or a random forest allows you to then later explain why that was selected. And it may be something that we've never seen before, and therefore the highly experienced analysts weren't able to pick up. And from my experience, that's going to be minority of fraud. It's not going to be most of what you see. However, if you don't look for it, it's not going to be there. So if you're able to then add that on top of that human experience and human know-how, you're able to improve the protection that you provide. So I would love to see us as an industry go into more of that and understanding not just past experience, but what are the unknown unknowns.
I love it how you make it sound like we are the Justice League fighting together, fighting crime in the city.
Well, I can neither confirm nor deny that we all have superpowers.
That's cool. Exactly on that point brings to my curious question. How much is real what we see in the movies about the frauds and everything, either by the good or the bad guys? I don't know, technology, process, ideas, whatever. You want to talk about it?
I don't have a good answer to that, unfortunately. I guess it would probably depend on the movie you're talking about. I can certainly tell you about physics in movies. So the core, spot on. That is exactly how the Earth works. You've got to launch nukes into the core to keep it moving. From a fraud point of view, look, it depends what you're seeing. I haven't actually watched it before, but I've heard that Mr. Robot is quite good from a cybercrime point of view. It's actually fairly accurate representation of what people do. When they show coding, it's actually very, very accurate coding. I can't speak to it. So I think it would probably depend on the movie. Some of it is right, some of it is not. There's a few sort of misconceptions people have. I've seen people that have like sleeves that they put their credit card or the passport in, and it says that, you can't pick the RFID up through it. And I am not aware of any technology to pick up your RFID without you literally tapping your card against it. Certainly not through your wallet, certainly not through your pants. I would say that that's a misconception. Other than that, as long as you're not clicking on links and downloading things that you shouldn't be, don't ever provide your login details for any sort of financial institution to anyone, including your financial institution. We won't ask for it. You're pretty much safe. So beyond that, if you have any movies in particular you're curious about or any particular technologies, I'd be happy to address them.
Exactly right now, I don't have any particular one in the top of my head. But the one that you mentioned, Mr. Robot, that's good to know.
Yeah, I've heard that one is quite good, yeah.
Yeah, I'm watching that now. It's pretty good. So is there anything else you would like to add or discuss, Tyler?
I'd just like to thank you guys again for having me on. And I would encourage everyone in data science to keep at it. I think it's a great field. I would encourage people to, just keep working on it. Like it can be challenging at times. I think it's very rewarding. There's a lot of different opportunities. Don't worry if you start off in academia and end up somewhere else. Don't worry if you start off somewhere else and end up in academia. People change jobs all the time, and that's fine. And the fact that you can come from a background that's different from other people gives you a view that oftentimes would otherwise be unknown. So I love to bring in people from different backgrounds into my team. I think a mix of jobs that people have worked on, genders, races, cultures, all contributes to the way that we see problems. And if you can bring something in or a view that you can bring in that's different from somebody else, please, please, please speak up. I hope beyond anything else that you have a manager or a team that supports you in speaking up, because you should. Bringing in these new ideas is what helps us grow, not just as a fraud industry, not just as academia, but as people. To be frank, it's wonderful to bring in new ideas. So no matter who you are, no matter what your background is, if you love it, keep pushing through with it. You can find people that will support you. You will unfortunately come across people that do not support you, but don't let them dominate how you see yourself.
And what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Oh, I'm bad at social media, so I apologize for this. LinkedIn is probably the best way. So feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. I've got a fairly large network. I try to respond to people when they message me. I don't have a Twitter. I don't have a podcast. so I'm fairly old-fashioned in those regards. Please do reach out if you can. And please keep searching and working on the things you love.
Well, this has been such an exciting conversation, and I want to thank you for your time and for sharing your experiences and all this valuable knowledge and advice with us. It has been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much.